last week we ended off at Rabbi Huda says, "Havizar b'Talmud Torah." Be very careful because a mistake. Sheshiga Talmud Olazaton. If you make a mistake, there are no mistakes. There are no mistakes that are acceptable. God forbid, an airline pilot makes a mistake. Like there are things that are just not acceptable. So we say that's impossible. Of course, we make mistakes in the study of Torah. We explain that Torah is especially, it's a subjective field. It's not only objective. There's a lot of objectivity, but there's a lot of subjectivity. And the Rashi quote, Asher Nasi Yechta, which really means when, or when the Nasi, the leader, sins. And Rashi quotes Ashrei Ador, how wonderful is the generation where the leader sins and he admits his sin, because we discussed it's impossible for leaders not to sin. But we explained last week, I think, that the focus is on if he isn't careful enough, if he doesn't do 100% effort, then it's considered, then there are no excuses. And that's is the tension between, on the one hand, that's the tension Rav Moshe Feinstein describes in his introduction to Rav Moshe, that on the one hand, who is he? What permission does he have to answer halachic like questions? And on the other hand, b'makom sheinish, like we learn in Pirkei Avot, where there's nobody else, you have to do it. You have to step forward and take the role. As a matter of fact, we're coming up on Tisha B'Av, so the end of the story, the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. So the Gemara needs a whole shir, at least one whole shir. But at the end of the story, the Gemara has this funny expression, or this weird expression, anvatunato, the anivut, the humility of Reb Zachariah ben Avkulis. That's the reason the temple was destroyed and we were exiled, not because of Kamsa, not because of Bar Kamsa and the rabbis and the whole story there, because Reb Zachariah ben Avkulis, if you recall the story, I'll quickly refresh your memories. He was the one when the rabbis realized that Bar Kamsa was up to no good. He was insulted, they threw him out of the party. For good reason he was insulted, and for good reason he was angry at the rabbis. He had what to complain about. But still, to go to the Romans and say the Jews are causing a revolt, and so the rabbis realized that they have a problem on their hand and they have to deal with it. So they had two options. They could accept the sacrifice that the rabbis that the Romans had sent, that he, had a little bit of a blemish that normally wouldn't be accepted. Okay, but to preserve the peace with the government, what we know from Pirkei Avot, it's so important, it's okay, we can let the korban. Or the option number two, the more severe option, is to kill him. He was like a moser. He wanted to harm the Jewish people. On both options, Rav Zachariah ben Avkula said, no, we can't do that. Yomru, Shema Yom. People are going to say all kinds of, you can kill somebody for no reason, or you can bring improper sacrifices. Reb Zachariah ben Avkulis, and the Gemara has the expression, Shema Yomru. What will people say? I find that a fascinating comment. When a politician, when a leader, forget a politician, that's what most politicians only care about, what people will say. But a true leader does what's right, not what people will say. It's nice. So what people will say, that's no good. And then, so the Maritz Chayetz, he's printed in the back of all the standard Talmuds. He's a fascinating character in his own right, really quite a unique individual, Galician, great Talmud scholar, but a real independent thinker. So he has a fascinating comment. He says, why does the Gemara use the language, the anivut, the humility? So he says, because Reb Zachariah ben Avkulis felt, who am I? I'm a nobody rabbi, right? Have you heard of him? Is he Rabbi Akiva? Is he Rabbi Meir? He's not, so you haven't heard of him. But he was the leader. He was the rabbi there. He was the most learned person. He was afraid. He was afraid to take a halachic stance. And because of that, the temple was destroyed. That's how the Gemara goes and presents it. So you see the opposite side, that a leader, a rabbi, has to issue a position, even if it's mistaken. That's normal. What our Mishnah was concerned about is when a person doesn't work hard. He's lazy a little bit. He doesn't pay attention too much, like the Gemara says, amazingly, by the students of Hillel and Shammai, the Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. We discussed this last year. one approach to all the arguments between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai was Shalosh Shimchu Rabbeim Kol Tzorcham. They didn't fully pay attention in class. They didn't fully get it. So Naset Torah Kishtei Torah, and the Torah became like two. It's a very harsh criticism of the Beit Hillel and the Beit Shammai. The Gemara distinguishes between Hillel and Shammai, who almost never argued, and Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, who always argued. And even though there are other Gemaras that say otherwise, and we discussed that last year, but anyways, you have this idea that if you don't pay attention, then terrible things, the Torah comes into two. But otherwise, if you try your best, even if you're just, Rav Skari Ben Akuz, you're not the most famous rabbi in the world, you're not the most learned rabbi in the world, it doesn't matter. Sometimes you're the one who has to make a decision. So that's the continuation, I guess, what we began last week, that a mistake in learning is considered like you are fully responsible. But then the Mishnah continues, and of course we always say, why is it in the same Mishnah? What in the world? It's a totally different topic. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, well, no, Mishnah Shlosha Ktarim Heim. There are three crowns. There is Keter Torah, the crown of Torah, Keter Kahuna, the crown of a priesthood, and Keter Malchut, the crown of kingdom. And Rabbi Shimon says nothing about these crowns. He's not interested in these crowns. He's interested in the last part of the Mishnah. These crowns, so to speak, are discussed in the sixth and add a chapter in Pirkei Avot. We know Pirkei Avot is only 5 chapters, but since the custom developed to learn it between Pesach and Shavuot, and there's 6 weeks, so they had a finagle. They had to do something to learn on the 6th week. So they had to make up something. So it's not so hard. We've got lots of material, lots of rabbinic material. So the beginning of the 6th parak, Shanu Chachamim B'Lashon HaMishnah, our rabbis taught in the language of the Mishnah, and they quote other sayings, and it all has to relate to the receiving of the Torah, because this is the week before Shavuot. That's how the minhag developed. And we celebrate Shavuot as Matan Torah. So that's the chapter that talks about the beauty of Torah, the 48 ways of Torah. That Mishnah, how do you acquire the Keter Torah, the crown of Torah, the 48 ways to acquire Torah. So the Mishnah begins, there's the Keter Malchut and Keter Kahuna, and Keter Torah is greater because it's funny why the Mishnah there says that, but there it says the Keter, the Kohanim get 24 gifts. Truma, different gifts. You had to give halach, zroa, keva, lechaim, when you sacrificed an animal, or when you brought an animal, all kinds of different gifts are 24. The Malchut, the kingdom, has 30 laws, 30 hierarchies, and Torah has 48. There are 48 ways, and that's where the Mishnah discusses Keter Kahuna, Keter Malchut, and Keter Torah. Here, Rabbi Shimon's interest is the contrast. He says there are 3 Ketarim. There's the Keter Torah, the Torah, Kahuna, and Malchut, and then he says, but, maybe but, the Keter Shem Tov Oleh Gabeim, and the crown of a good name surpasses them all. Now, of course, his math is very poor. We're going to have to get there. I count 4. There's Keter Kahuna, Keter Malchut, Keter Torah. The most important Keter is Keter Shem Tov. So he begins the Mishnah. There are 3, and he answers 4. So if anybody wants to chime in with an answer, that would be wonderful. We'll get there in a couple minutes or so. But he's not telling us, he's not interested in the crowns. He's interested in the crown of a good name. So let's discuss what's the connection. What does that have to do with anything? What does this have to do with the beginning of the Mishnah that says if you make a mistake in Torah, we don't view it as a mistake if you didn't try hard enough. We're going to view it as a intentional sin. So you got to be very, very, very careful when you issue a Torah. So what's the connection between that and the crowns of Torah? So you could say, okay, the crown of Torah, not to make a mistake, a crown of whatever. It could be. I don't really think that's works so well. I think perhaps, and this is maybe a little bit more radical or whatever, that what he's saying is that the mistake is when your Torah is disconnected from a good name. The purpose of learning Torah is to create a good name. And that's the famous Gemara Gemara I like to quote very often, the Gemara in Yuma, page 86. We'll get there in Daf Yomi in a few days, where the Gemara says, "V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha." You have to love your Lord, your God, with all your heart, with all your might, with all the soul. We say it, at least twice a day. So what does v'ahavta mean? So the Gemara says, Sheyehei Shem Shamayim mitahev al yadcha, that the name of God shall be beloved because of you. It doesn't mean you shall love God. It means you shall cause others to love God. V'ahavta, v'ihafta, really, if the grammar that way. You should cause others to love God. Sheyeh Shem Shamayim. And that's where the Gemara says that a person can learn Torah day and night, and but if they're not nice and they're not honest in their business dealings, people are going to hate Torah. Say, look, oy, 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 how terrible it is. This person learns Torah, his father taught him Torah, and he's not a nice person. But if a person has, quote unquote, a good name and people like him, people will come to learn Torah. So perhaps, and this unfortunately, I think maybe it's a modern interpretation, sometimes we live in a world where the majority of the Jewish people do not see, many of them are like Judaism and they're connected, but they don't see the overarching importance of Torah, of Talmud Torah, Keneged Kulam. It's the lifeline of the Jewish people. And that's, of course, then there are many Jews who Bichlal don't have anything to do with Torah. But they express their Judaism in social justice and et cetera, which are very important ideas. So sometimes people who learn Torah lose sight of the fact, and there's such a disconnect, we can't relate to these people. Sometimes people look at people who keep Torah like they have nothing in common. And so what I'm arguing is that the role of somebody who learns Torah, it's an easy mistake. It's you're not intending that. You love Torah so much, you forget. Often people, experts like that, they don't realize what the common person is thinking. So perhaps, I don't know, this is my own idea. What the Mishnah is trying to teach us is that the mistake sometimes make in Torah is that you're not supposed to learn Torah for its own sake. Or Torah lishma doesn't mean to learn Torah just to learn Torah. It means Torah to have an impression, to make the world a better place, to have an influence. So people will say, there's a Keter Shem Tov. The Keter Shem Tov. I don't know. But if anybody has a better explanation, why these two teachings, that better don't make a mistake in Torah, and then talking about the crown of Torah, and well, I know that's what the crown of kingdom and the crown of the priesthood are important, but the most important crown, of course, is the crown of a good name. So firstly, before we get to the 4 crown, problems, there are 4 crowns, not 3 crowns. So we know that Torah is different from Malchut and Kuna. Well, that's what we're going to see in a second. An interesting argument, but the Kahuna and the Malchut, of course, you're born into it. You can't. The old joke, my father was a Kohen, my grandfather was a Kohen. You can't become a Kohen, and you can't become a Melech either. Som tasim alecha Melech, and the halacha is Melech is hereditary. It's not. And we've discussed or mentioned in the past. I think last year, Tzvi Grumet gave a shiur on 4 models of leadership, and he talked about, which is in Parshat Shoftim. We'll read in a few weeks. But the problem with hereditary, of course, is competence. Just because the father is great doesn't mean the son's going to be great. Chizkiyahu, one of our greatest kings, was the father of the worst king we ever had. Menashe, who ruled for 52 years. And the Gemara relates, Chizkiyahu didn't want to have any kids. That's also a fascinating Gemara in Brachot. Chizkiyahu didn't want to have any kids. He was dying young, and he didn't know what he did wrong. So God sent Yeshayahu, Hanavi, to tell him, why didn't you have kids? Well, what's wrong? The first mitzvah in the Torah, to have kids. Are you crazy? I have a vision. My son's going to be a awful child who wants to bring him into the world. So Yeshaya says, "Bekifsei derachmana." I don't remember the exact expression. In the secrets of heaven, that's not for you. You have a mission in life to have kids. You don't have a mission to worry what the kids are going to. You try your best. All we can do is effort. Can try. So you have to have kids. So the greatness can be followed by awfulness, and that's the distinction between Aaron and Moshe. Aaron's had the merit that his kid, well, first Elazar, was appointed the Kohen Gadol. Then this week, of course, Pinchas, the grandson, who really gets the kahuna, established for what he did. That's a whole other discussion, but I guess the Brit Kahunat Olam. So Aaron had the Naches, had the grandchildren who were capable. Moshe, of course, did not. His children were basically nobodies and probably worse. We mentioned before, Pasuk and Shoftim seems to say pretty black and white. His grandchildren were involved in idolatry. So sometimes the greatest of the great can have, and sometimes it's Stavka because they're the greatest of the great. It's very hard when a person is such a public figure, often their family gets neglected. God told Moshe to neglect his family. That's the whole criticism of Miriam and Aaron. God told Moshe, leave your wife. We live with our spouses. Why can't you, Moshe? So God says, no, Moshe is different. So Taka, he neglected his family, and you see the results. But anyways, the kingdom and the kahuna are hereditary. There is certain value, and there's a stability there. There is something, God's on. That's one type of leadership. By the way, the Navi, who's not mentioned here, he's a different type of a leader. And the Navi, of course, is not hereditary. The Navi is chosen by God for their special talents. So Torah is not hereditary. And that's the assumption. The fact that it is today much more than it used to be, I think, or sometimes it is, I don't know, it is a problem. It's not good. I think the Gemara says that why are the children of Talmidei Chachamim not Talmidei Chachamim? Why do you have great rabbis and great Torah scholars? Their children can be nice people, nice businessmen. So you have that a lot. So the Gemara says people shouldn't think that Torah is an inheritance, just like the kahuna is an inheritance and the kingdom is an inheritance. People think, what do you want from me? My father wasn't a rabbi. His father's a rabbi. Anybody who grew up as a rabbi's kid, as I did, and there's certain expectations, fairly or unfairly. I think I don't feel it really. I don't know Tova if she felt it at all. Tova was a wonderful student, unlike me. All the teachers say, "Are you Tova's brother? How can that be? How can your sister, who is an amazing student, followed by me, the bomb and everything? No, what can one do?" But there are certain expectations. Your father's a rabbi. That's why he used to learn with you, and that's why you know what you know. So the Torah doesn't want that to happen. The Gemara says very often the children of Torah scholars are very ignorant, and I think you have that much more in the modern Orthodox world. You look, many of the great rabbis and leaders who are there. I mean, Jonathan Sachs now, he comes from a very Pashuta family. His father was not at all learned. They weren't even fully Orthodox. You have a lot of that. Great leaders not coming from wonderful family, or learned families. So that's very important. So people shouldn't think Torah is a Yerusha. Anybody can get Torah. The Torah is Munach, and anybody can come and get it. So already the Mishnah doesn't make that distinction here. The Mishnah groups together Keter Kahuna, Keter Malchut, Keter Torah, and distinguishes it from Keter, the crown of a good name. But it is interesting, but we generally assume there is a distinction between Torah that's available to all, and the Rambam writes that the mitzvah to learn is whether you're wealthy and whether you're poor and whether you're young and whether you're old and whether you're physically well or not so physically well. Everybody has the obligation to learn Torah. Torah is everybody. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Morasha kilet Yaakov, and Rav Soloveitchik points out beautifully in one of his in Al Tshuva, which we've discussed the book, the Tshuva Drushes, Atem nitzavim hayom kolchem. You're all standing here as we're about to end the land visual. Chotvei eitzim, the wood choppers and the water carriers, they're the same. You have nine men who are Moshe Rabbeinu's. There's no minion. 10 men who are wood choppers. You do have a minion, but the wood choppers and the water carriers and everybody, they're part of the Torah community. The covenant was made with all. So that's the distinction. But I said the Mishnah doesn't make a distinction. So there's some who actually saying I think, of course, they are both true. Just have to, know when. Keter Torah, it's also, not everybody can have the Keter Torah. The Keter is on the other hand. Everybody knows that Keter Malchut, Keter Guna, you can't have unless you're born into it. Of course, if you're born into it, you don't have to do anything. It's given to you. It's sort of meaningless. It can be meaningless. The Keter Torah, while you have to earn it on your own, but not everybody can earn it. because not everybody is gifted with a brilliant memory. I always, sometimes they teach, the Chafetz Chaim did this and this one did that, and, or the Vilna Gaon. So, I'm not the Vilna Gaon. And I think sometimes these stories are harmful because if people feel they can't live up to expectations. If you talk too much about the stories of the Chafetz Chaim and what a tzaddik he was, and or the Vilna Gaon learning, he put his feet in cold water so he wouldn't fall asleep, so he could learn. So he could learn 22 hours a day, and you tell that, in your formative years, and that's the message of the yeshiva. That can be a very destructive, terrible message because many people, not all, for some people it can be inspiring, but for many people it can say, I'm a nobody. But you know what? No, you should have learned 22. You're not the Vilna Gaon. You're not. I don't expect you to do that. I don't want you to do that. You're not the Chafetz Chaim. The Keter Torah, you have to be gifted with a phenomenal IQ, with phenomenal. You don't have whatever, all kinds of things. You have you're not a social animal. You're not a sports fan. I don't know. You're not something that all the things we spend time on growing up. You become a gadol Torah. Although I had heard the story in the name of Rabbi Hirschsprung, but people tell me now, I forget who they say the story in. Maybe the Reb Paleach, the Meitzitzer Eloi. The Meitzitzer Eloi was the one who Dov Rebel brought to Yeshiva University, the first true Gadol B'Yisrael, I think, in America. He came to America in the 1920s or so. Dr. Rebel at Yeshiva University, that was always, they brought over, they tried to offer jobs to great Torah scholars. The Meitzitzer Eloi was, they called him the Meitzitzer Eloi because he was a super genius, the student of Reb Chaim. He died a young man, unfortunately, of a toothache. He got a tooth infection and he died. So they say the story, I know about him, or I had heard about Rabbi Hirschsprung in Montreal, who passed away not so long ago. Maybe people even here knew him, that they were such great Torah scholars that when they were children, they didn't let them play. All the kids would go to recess and play, and they wouldn't let them play. You're going to be the next Gadol B'Yisrael, so you have to spend every single moment learning Torah. And apparently they said, both of them, it's true. It doesn't matter who it's about. All these stories, they don't have to be true. The story doesn't have to be literally true. It's just, conceptually true. But it probably is literally true. That they said, I would have been the same Torah scholar had I played a few minutes of ball also. It's healthy to play ball. It doesn't take away. You can get a PhD at University of Berlin and still be the greatest Torah genius. They say this, the Rabbi apparently told this story when the Rav Soloveitchik, PhD in neo-Kantian philosophy, and he wanted to do a PhD on Plato and the Rambam, but there was nobody in the University of Berlin to oversee such a PhD, and he knew everything about modern thought and so many fields, so many disciplines. So they asked him and yet you're the greatest scholar in the Talmud, the Dvar Avraham. When they gave Rav Soloveitchik, smicha, the Dvar Rav Avraham Kana Shapiro, the Rav Warsaw, I think, who was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto. I think that's the one who gave the Rav Smicha. The Rav was, 25 years old before he was coming to America. And he wrote that if all the rabbis in the world say A, if every rabbi in the world, there were plenty of great rabbis around that time. And Rabbi Soloveitchik says B, you do B. That's what he wrote in his smicha. So that's pretty unbelievable. So they asked the Rav, how did you become like this? When do you have time to do this? So he said, well, you were talking about me, wondering how I learn all this stuff. That's when I studied philosophy. No, it's a cute line, but the idea is you can find time for everything. But we're not Rav Soloveitchiks. We're not going to be Rav Soloveitchik. We're not Rabbi Lichtenstein. We don't have that brain. I don't know. Maybe somebody here does. So that's why some say the Keter Torah, just like the Keter Kahuna and the Keter Malchut, is not for everybody. No. This Mishnah, everybody can learn Torah, but the Keter Torah, the crown of Torah, that somebody can be the prince of Torah, whatever, it's not hereditary necessarily, and we don't want it to be hereditary. It isn't good when you have five, the Soloveitchik family had 3 generations in a row where the greatest Torah scholar probably was the Beis Halevi, Reb Chaim, Moshe, the Rav, I don't know, maybe 4 generations in a row. The Brisker Rav, the genius, but that's an exception. You don't have that really. And we know there are many Rosh Yeshivas that, remember Schneur Lyman once made a comment. I heard him make the comment that In Harvard, they don't appoint you based on who your father was. You don't become the Rosh Yeshiva of Harvard. You don't become a professor in Harvard because your father, you may get accepted to Harvard because your parents went to Harvard in the acceptance, but you don't become a professor at Harvard. And to become a Rosh Yeshiva just because you have the right name, sometimes they're worthy, sometimes they're in. Okay, that's whatever, however you want to apply it. But it is interesting is the Keter Malchut, how the Keter Torah works. And I think this is really, both are true. Torah is available for everybody, but we have to know our limitations, and not everybody's going to be great in Torah, and that's fine. You shouldn't be, you shouldn't strive. That's the matter of fact. The debate, the Mishnah says, we're going to get to in a year or two or three or four, please God. And the fifth parak, it says so we have a life plan. So at the age of 5, you learn Tanakh. And the age of 10, you learn Mishnah. And the age of 15, you learn Talmud. That's a biggie. Not supposed to learn like Talmud to the age of 15 for normal people. They don't follow that in our schools. The age of 18, you get married. Ben Shmones Vilchos. We don't follow that either. Usually, at least the men, and that's who they're talking about. In the Hasidic circles, they do. But the Gemara has another opinion. Gemara has another opinion that you get married at 20, not 18. Okay, then the Gemara has up to 22, whatever. So some of the commentators explain what's the issue? Get married at 15, get married at 18 or 20. Remember, people died young or whatever. What's the issue? So someone who explained the Gemara has a debate. How long does it take? Well, how much effort should you put? You want to produce a Rav Moshe Feinstein. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but how long does it take? You want to go to medical school. How many times do you have to apply and not get accepted till you realize, you know what, maybe medicine's not for me? How many times do you have to take organic chemistry and get a C plus and realize, it's not for me? So the Gemara says either 3 years or 5 years. You have to. Some people bloom a little later. So that's what someone explained. You learn Talmud. The Gemara assumes, and on a certain level, it also requires more elucidation, that of course when you get married, you can't spend the same amount of time learning. The most basic reason is because you have to work for a living. They didn't have this idea of a kollel, or you didn't have a rich father-in-law, a rich father, whatever. You went to work. That was the assumption of the Talmud. When you get married, you write in the ksuba, the husband writes, I'm going to support you on the eflach, okir, va'ezun, va'parnes, yechi, lichi, kihilchut guvrain, the way it's done, how men support their women. It's against the ksuba for a wife to support her husband. The husband has to support the wife. That's what it says in the ksuba. No. So some say, well, that's it. You get married at 50. You get married if it's 3, you get married at 18. You know what? If he's going to become a super Torah scholar, you know what? We'll push off his wedding a little bit, because you need those few years when you're single and you can learn 20 hours a day. People are trumas meeting. That. People like that. Maybe you've met them. People who are, I don't want to start naming names of the people I know who, when they were 18, 19, 20, were literally learning 18, 19 hours a day. They sat in yeshiva up till 2 o'clock in the morning, the first one in the morning, last one out at night. They didn't take breaks. You can't get married in that situation. You can't do that for your life, but you can do that 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So you do that till 24, and then you get married. So the Gemara is saying, for normal people, you get married 8:50. That's it. Time to go earn a living, and that's it. So you shouldn't feel you're doing something wrong if you don't have the Keter Torah. Perhaps to learn Torah, yes, everybody's kovei eating the Torah. You're supposed to. That's the second question they asked you in Shemaim. Discussed last week. The first question were your business dealings done be'emunah. Second question is we're kovati eating the Torah, but the Keter Torah perhaps is reserved for only a few people. Okay, now let's get to the 3 crowns and the 4 crowns. I gave you a lot of time. He doesn't know how to count here. There are 3 crowns: Kahuna, Malchut, and Torah, and the crown of a good name supersedes them all. So there are 4 crowns, and the best crown is the crown of a good name. So why are there only 3 crowns? That's what I'm here for, no? Okay, anybody? No, Tova, you don't have any insights. I can pick on my sister. It's okay.
Well, it encompasses all 3 of them.
I'm sorry? Well, so the idea they say is that if you don't have a Keter Shem Tov, if you don't have the Keter Torah, the prerequisite for Keter Shem Tov, for Keter Kahuna, Keter Malchut, and Keter Torah is a Shem Tov. Yeah, you can have a king who doesn't, then he's not really have the Keter of the kingship. He's just wearing it, but he doesn't really have it. So the the Keter Shem Tov is the prerequisite for Keter Kahuna, Keter Torah, and Keter Malchut. That's why he doesn't say there are 4 crowns. I have 4 crowns, so I wear 2 crowns. I wear the crown of a Torah scholar and a Kohen, but I don't have such a good name. That cannot be. That cannot be. The Keter, you cannot, the Keter Shem Tov is the basis, so it's not counted as a separate crown. You want to discuss Keter Torah, be a real king, a real Kohen. A Kohen is supposed to be. Then first get the Keter Shem Tov. That's the most important, the prerequisite. Then we can discuss the other crowns. That's sort of like the view of the Abarbanel and others that, belief in God is not one of the mitzvot in the Torah. According to the Rambam, it's the primary mitzvah of the Torah. Yesod Yesodot v'Amud Amudot. The foundation of foundations is to know there's a God. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the first of the 10 commandments. But you notice Anochi isn't really a commandment; it's a statement. And the Abarbanel says, no, we don't count. It's not one of the 613 mitzvot. What is the guy going to say? You know what? I went through the whole Torah. I really love the Torah. But there's one thing I don't like about it. I like 612 mitzvot of the Torah. That mitzvah of belief in God, that's not for me. I don't believe in creed. Yeah, I like to give tzedakah, not to take revenge. I love Shabbat even. All these things. I don't believe in God. So that's, I keep 612 of the 613 mitzvot. So that's insane. So, but in other words, you can't have the mitzvah to believe in God because every other mitzvah is dependent on that mitzvah. That's what some say. Of course, the Rambam. So what does the Rambam do with that? So why does the Rambam say you do have to believe in God? When he thinks it's okay. I keep Shabbos, but I don't believe in God. What does that mean? For the Rambam, the mitzvah to believe in God doesn't mean to believe in God. It means to philosophize, be a philosopher. That's the part they didn't like on the Rambam. They burned his books. I mean, the Rambam, philosophy, learning Gemara is small stuff. Is Habayit Abayit Rev is a davar katan. Masa Merkaba, to study the ways of God, metaphysics and philosophy. Wow, that's what it means. So when the Rambam counts belief in God, it doesn't mean to believe in God, that there's a creator. That, of course, is the foundational. The other mitzvot don't make sense, sort of, without them. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Depends, I don't know. But for sure, the mitzvot between man and God don't. But it's a mitzvah to do much more. But anyways, here everybody agrees, I think. The Keter Shem Tov only makes the Keter Kahuna and the Keter Torah, most importantly, and the Keter Malchut, only makes sense, right? If you have a leader who doesn't have a good name, that's not good. The Keter Shem Tov is the basis of everything else that we do, just like belief in God. We have today, won't get into social orthodoxy. I don't really believe in God, but I like the mitzvah of the Torah. No, it's also not so bad. We have that coming up also on Tisha B'Av. I think it's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. No, I have to look and forget. Where does it go? Otita zovu vet mitzvotai tishmor. In other words, the Nabi says, forget about God. Who cares? I don't care what you think about God. Just do the mitzvah of the Torah. Just do what the Torah says. Belief in God can come later. There is sort of an idea like that. Just do what you have to do. Belief in God. I don't know. It's everything. But that's a whole. This again requires a whole different type of a discussion. There was interesting discussion in halacha about what about a person who does mitzvot not because he thinks it's a mitzvah. He taka really is an atheist. He really doesn't believe in God, but he greatly believes in doing many of the mitzvot of the Torah. He went to day school and he thinks the Torah is beautiful insights, written by human beings, beautiful insights. So how does that impact mitzvot? The bottom line, we don't know, obviously. We don't really know, but there is a discussion, but there is a concept we have in rabbinic literature. Who cares if you believe in God? Just do the mitzvah. Just do what's right. And the truth of the matter, that's why the Gemara, in today's world, we are very much into, what's his theological position and advice, orthoprax, and we don't care because he's not orthodox. He might practice that, but in the Gemara, they only judge people on what they did. What you believed in, that was between you and God. How first of all, we don't. How do we know what's in your mind? And people, it doesn't really. we can only measure people on what they do. That might be impacted on what they believe, but anyways, that's what we do. But the Keter Shem Tov is very good. And of course, just I'll say a few things that I think are rather obvious, but need to be said. That's having a good name is imitating God. Perhaps the key mitzvah of the Torah, of Soloveitchik always used to say, is to imitate God. Mahu rachum apatarachum. The same way God is merciful, we're merciful. The same way God is kind, we're kind. That's what we say. The Yud Gimel Mitot. So we have to emulate God in all we do. Whatever the Torah tells us about God is telling us about man. We can't understand anything about God, the Maimonidean view, right? So if the Torah tells us something about God, God is a creator. The Torah, we don't know how God created the world, but it teaches man must be a creator. Whatever the Torah tells us about God, that we're created in the image of God. We discussed last week how we treat other people reflects how we believe in God. If I believe in God, I'm going to treat you differently than if I don't believe in God, because I believe you're B'Tselem Elohim. So everything about God is really about us. We have to emulate God. That's what we call the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. That's what we call it, Chilul Hashem, to desecrate God's name. And the Rambam writes, this is the only mitzvah that you can't do tshuva for in this world. There is no tshuva for desecrating the name of God. Ki Shem Hashem Nikra Lecha. It's all about having the name of God upon us. What does Avraham do? What do all the Avot do? Vayikra b'Shem Hashem. Vayikra b'Shem Hashem. We say on the Slichas 500 times, to call out in God's name. But Avraham, that's wherever we call out in God's name, and that's of course what Migdal Babel. That was the sin of Migdal Babel. That's the story right before Abraham. That's the contrast. That's chapter 11. I believe it's chapter 11 in Bereshit. They're all one. Which would be a great name for us. Look in the parsha. They wanted to build for themselves a great name, and that's not our goal in life, to make ourselves great towers and great names, and it's to build for God. So in other words, right after the story of Migdal Babel, that's when we meet Avraham Avinu, because Avraham Avinu is the exact opposite. Avraham Avinu is building a name for God. That's what Rav Soloveitchik beautifully explained. There are 120 members in the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the people who saved Judaism. We daven Shmon Esrei today because of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. We say brachot because of them. We make Kiddush because of them. They set the patterns of Jewish life, the beginning of the Second Temple period, the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Without Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, we wouldn't be here. So how many people do you know who were in the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? Name them. Name the people. You can put it in the chat box. Who do you know who is a member of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah? You can't name more than 5 if you're really good. You're really good, and maybe some can name nobody. And we don't. And because we don't. He says that historically nobody ever wrote biographies. This is a new genre. Art Scroll has 5,000 biographies of great rabbis, and not only that, the academic research. Professor Twersky, the Rough son-in-law, did his PhD. He wrote his thesis on the Ravid, an academic dissertation on the Ravid. And Mark Shapiro did it on the Sridei. And last night's speaker, Rabbi Levine, did it on the Chacham Tzvi. These are academic biographies. It's the same idea as opposed to art scrolls. They don't claim to be academic. They're not meant to be academic biographies. This is a new genre. He says the normal way is that throughout history we didn't write about biographies because it wasn't the people's, didn't matter. It was their actions. As a matter of fact, the idea of a leader is to go into oblivion, that nobody should know who he is. Like he's important in his generation, and the next generation carries on. That's so against the way we think. We want to, we want the legacy forever. But Rav writes, in the Yom Kippur Machzor, they quote this from Rav Soloveitchik. We don't know who the members of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah were, because that's the Jew works for God. And it's not important if you have a name, and you can being anonymous is great. And we know many people wrote books anonymously. It was not uncommon to write, anonymously. So that's today that won't work. Whatever, there is a reason the genre of rabbinic biographies has caught on today, because we live in a different society. But the goal is to make for God a name, not for make ourselves a name. And that's the contrast between the Migdal Babel and Avraham Avinu. So the Keter Shem Tov Olel Gabeim, yes, of course, it's referring to our own name and how we live our life and how we're nice. And without a Keter Shem Tov, you can't have the Keter of Torah. But the Keter Shem Tov is also a way to bring glory unto God's name. V'nigdashti, right? Kishem Hashem Nikra Alecha, Kishem Hashem Akacha Kra. How do we start the Shmon Esrei? It's all about the name of God. It's interesting. I was just thinking of that, of course, this past week, Shivasar B'Tammuz. So we read the most beautiful Haftorah of the year. Dushur Hashem b'matzokaru b'yotokaru. It's such a beautiful, beautiful Haftorah. Yeshayahu Hanavi, and of course the one of the psukim. V'natati lehem b'veiti b'chomotai. I will give for them in my house, in my home, in my walls of Yerushalayim. Yad Vashem. That's of course the origins of the name of the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem. Tov mibanim u'mibanot, better than children, because it's talking about those who can't have children. Well, Imara Saris, I can't have any children. So God says, it's okay, you don't have any children. God doesn't bless everybody with children. I will give you a Yad Vashem. I will give you a hand and a name. Tov mibanim u'mibanot, greater than children. Shem olam eitenu, I'll give them a name, an everlasting name. The everlasting name, is eitenu asher lo yikarek, that will never be cut off. And that's just an interesting notion of the concept of name. It's actually a very powerful, pasuk. I don't know how many people think of it, but now, whenever they read the pasuk, I think of Yad Vashem, and of course, it's such a beautiful, name and a tragic name, really, but a beautiful name to pick for the Holocaust memorial. But anyways, the Keter Shem Tov here, I think Rabbi Shulman is talking about us, but of course, everything else is about God. So that's okay. So that's Mishnah, Keter Torah, Keter Kuna, Keter Malchut, whatever. And whether we can all have the Keter Torah, I don't know. But whether we can all learn Torah, that we can for sure do. Okay. Then the next Mishnah, Rab Nehurai Omer, and perhaps what's the continuation? Maybe the way to get the Keter Torah. This is also it's fascinating. Heavy Gole Lemakom Torah. Exile yourself, go galut to a place of Torah. And do not say that Torah will come after you. You have to go after it. That your friends will keep it for you. They'll teach it to you. They'll do it for you. And do not rely on your wisdom. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah says. So Rab Nehurai says you have to run away, be galut. You have to exile to a place of Torah. So before we discuss that, so first of all, there's a fascinating argument here between the Mefarshim and the Mishnah. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Exile yourself to a place of Torah. Does that mean it's not so good? But if the only place to get Torah is to go to Israel, I don't have Torah in America. Right? The only place I can go learn is somewhere else, 500 miles from my house. I live in Oshkosh, and there's nowhere to learn anymore. So I got to go learn. But it's Nebuch. I'd prefer to stay home, but I have to be goleh. Galut is a negative term. I have to exile myself to Torah. So that's how the Bartanur explains. The Mishnah is not saying something good. The Mishnah is saying even if the only way to acquire Torah is to leave home and to go far away, you have to be having gola, the Makam Torah. Go into Galut, yeah, it's a little bit exile, but that's the only way to get Torah. So that's the Bartanur. He says, really, it'd be better to stay home and to learn Torah. Well, why should you have to go to Galut to learn Torah? And the Tiferet Yisrael says, no. The Mishnah is saying, what are you talking about? To stay home. Got to watch the Montreal Canadiens, the hockey game, you're at home, and the distractions and this and that. You want to learn Torah, you got to get away from it all. He says, it's very harsh language. This is an open rebuke to students who think they're going to grow in Torah. But they come home for the weekend and they have the 4th of July barbecue, right? The 4th of Canada, they didn't, was muted a fair on whatever for good reason in Canada. Those who are following the news, it was a very unusual Canada Day yesterday, but July 4th, nice barbecue, he says, no, have you go the Makom Torah. A person can only acquire greatness in Torah, and that's probably the connection between the prior Mishnah, the Keter Torah. You have to exile yourself to Torah. So I think that's a fascinating debate. I don't know what you think about it, and whose side you're on, so to speak. And like all these debates, I think both are true. Just depends on the person, the situation. Some people really do need to get away now, and some people, it's not good to go away. And I think people send away people at too young an age. It's also what days you go away. I mean, in Europe, people learned in yeshiva, the 1/100th of 1%, it was less than that. What do they have in Europe before the war? Maybe 20,000 people learning in yeshiva. Maybe. I doubt it. I doubt it was that high. In Volozhin, the greatest yeshiva, they had 400 people at its maximum. Today, there are, I don't know, 8,000 people learning in Lakewood, and I don't know, 10,000 in the Mir, and I don't know, in Ponovich. And it's like, so many of those people really left home at a young age. They didn't have their cell phones with them, and travel wasn't like it is today. But mamish, or people like Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, these people, they left home at 11, 12. That's why some of them, their whole family became non-observant. They're the only observant person in their family. Sri Geisha, Rav Aaron Cutler, his sister, most of these Gedolei Torah, who you all know about, most of their siblings were not observant. Because they left home, they were brilliant. They left, they went to Yeshiva, they went away from home, and the modernity and the Haskalah and whatever swept their areas. Are you kidding? I don't have to go through all the names. I just mentioned a few of them. Most people rejected. They all had non-observant siblings. These people, so they were Golel the Makom Torah, and they created greatness. They became great. Was that so good? I don't know. Maybe it wasn't so good. Everything there, and leaving at a young age. So I think it really depends a lot. And I think the interesting sort of experiment today is the Israel phenomena, where every kid. And it's not exactly, but they're not going to Galut when they go to Israel, with their cell phones and with their whatever. But the idea of leaving home to study in yeshiva, and I think we do see evidence that for some people that's really was the only way they grew in Torah, was by leaving home. It's the first time they're in an atmosphere of Torah. And I think maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but I think in many. No, of course, not always. It's not of course, not true for everybody. But in many cases, the impact on the Americans is much greater than on the Israelis. In other words, often an American in 18 will grow much more in Torah learning than an Israeli who comes from a yeshiva high school and goes to yeshiva in Israel, even to a Hesed yeshiva. I don't want to, God forbid, sometimes you do see that the Americans get into it. They come from America. Wow, it's the first time they've been exposed to it. For an Israeli, they're just really, going sort of, it's like us going to university. It's not such, maybe it is, maybe in America it's more, I don't know. It's not such a break for the Israelis going to yeshiva, where for the Canadians, Americans, the chutzars people go all to Israel for a year. Now, 2 years is much more common. Way more people go for 2 years, some for more than 2 years. It's a totally transformative experience that I don't think the Israelis have. Is that always good? I don't know, but I think that's an interesting way. And there been some research. Shalom Berger years ago, I believe that's what his PhD was on, the influence of the year in Israel. And I don't think there's quite enough research done. He already wrote his PhD a number of years ago. We need sort of a new, updated, more research. We've now had basically 50 years, more or less, since after, on the 6 Day Wars, when this basically started. People going to Israel, there were some who went before, but not too many. So what the impact and how the religiosity grows, and how does it compare for, Israeli religions? That's a very fascinating idea, but that's what the missions have. It go to Makam Torah, and I think the debate is unresolvable, and it should be unresolvable, and it depends on the person. For some people, this is an unfortunate type of a necessity, that the only way to grow in Torah is to leave home. And for other people, leaving home is not the way to grow in Torah. And if they've got great Torah scholars here, why leave home? And whatever. I will say, as sort of a well-known comment, if you really want to get the Keter Torah, now we're going to talk about the elite of the elite, the crown of the Torah, assuming that's only for the very few. So almost every person who got the Keter Torah did not have a traditional education. Rav Soloveitchik didn't get it. He learned with this. They didn't go to normal schools, because every school, every yeshiva, even great yeshivas, even in Volozhin, Volozhin was a little bit different, but even many of the great yeshivas are I don't, constricting might be too harsh a word, but you have to think, there's a certain box in every educational institution. And kids who don't fit, we know that gifted kids often hate school because school's not for them. They're with normal kids. In Canada, we're cutting out all the gifted programs now. It's at least Vancouver, no more. Ontario just announced no more gifted programs in math. They used to have in high school, the gifted kids went within the school, that the gifted math program and the regular math. No, can't have that anymore. It discriminates against other people. Whatever you want to think about that, fine. So, but greatness cannot, greatness needs its own program. And many of the great people, they learned on their own. They didn't go to schools. Everybody has their own experience because it had to be very personalized for them. Rav Soloveitchik became great because he was a genius, but he learned with his father 15 hours a day, or he heard his father give Shem. He didn't go to school. He was school. His mother arranged for tutors to learn a gymnasium equivalent, what we would call a high school equivalency. Believe me, it wasn't the high school equivalency. I'm sure he was reading Aristotle, and I don't know what he was reading exactly, but more than we read in high school. And then he went to university, PhD, as we discussed at the beginning. So that's an interesting argument, heavy goal of the Makom Torah. Okay, so I just want to spend, and perhaps this will add a little bit an aspect to this. Who is Rav Nehurai? Rav Nehurai Omer. So I mentioned last week, these Mishnayos, beginning last week with the Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, they're all students of Rabbi Akiva. We mentioned after the Hadrianic revolt, the persecutions, Bar Kokhba revolt, the rabbis realized that this is it. The temple is not going to be built very soon. I think Rabbi Akiva believed Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach, but the temple would be rebuilt. He made a mistake, and they told him the hair will be growing on your arm or something, and the Mashiach won't. You'll be long dead, and the Mashiach's not going to be here. The rabbis began to realize Mashiach's not coming next year. We want Mashiach now. Ain't going to work. The sin that doesn't work that way. So they knew that. They knew we were going into a long exile. They had it. They could tell exactly. So it was time. It's time to change the style of Torah. They had to write down the oral Torah into the written Torah, and that's the students of Rabbi Akiva who began the process, completed 70 years later or so by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi as the final editor. So we have all the teachings of Rabbi Akiva's students. So Rav Nehurai, I don't know who he is. Is he Rabbi Akiva's student? So there's one opinion. He's Rabbi Meir. Rav Nehurai, which makes sense. Nehurai is light, Meir light, right? Nehurai, and the Gemara equates. The Gemara does say in one place, Rav Meir is Rav Nehurai. I mean, I'm not making this up. That's what one opinion. That this is Rav Meir and Rav Nehurai, the same person, and it's just different, like a nickname. Nehurai, and the Gemara says, Shaman ir einecha chamim balacha. Nehurai comes. He made the light. He illuminated the path of halacha. We discussed once before, Rav Meir was illuminated beyond belief. The Gemara says he was such a brilliant genius, we can't follow his rulings. We didn't understand him. He could declare a sheretz, a rodent, pure 50 ways. By definition, a rodent is impure. But Rav Meir was so brilliant, he could explain to you why a rodent is pure. Of course, that's an impossibility, but he was so brilliant, nobody could get to the bottom of his reasoning. He was Meir, he lit up the place. So some say Rav Meir is Rav Nehurai. The problem with that Gemara is that in the last Mishnah in Kiddushin, the Gemara quotes, that's the only time in Shas, mentioned this at one page in the 2,711 pages of the Talmud, where the Talmud discusses what profession you should have. We mentioned this before because the Torah couldn't care less what profession you have. Whatever profession you have, do it honestly, do it ethically, morally. Whatever, you have to provide for your family, that's a mitzvah. So whatever your talents are, whatever you want to do, you want to be a lawyer, it doesn't matter, just do it right. The Torah doesn't tell you what to do. The Torah just says what you do it properly. So Rabbi Meir says, that's the famous mission, so the Rabbi Meir. Olam yelamed adam et umnat kala umnakia. You know that expression, clean, and how do you translate it? Light and clean. It's a whole other shir, what that means. Many of our professions don't feel it. Working 18 hours a day to make a lot of money isn't umniki of a kala. Of course, you have to work 18 hours a day to make enough money to pay for day school education. That's a whole other discussion. But you have an umna kala b'nekiya. You can learn and you can work, spend time with the family. You can support yourself. How that works, not so simple. That's Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Nehurai says, no. Rabbi Nehurai say, I'm not going to teach my child anything. I'm just going to teach Torah. Because Torah, in the real world, when you get sick, you don't make any money. They didn't have any sick pay. They didn't have any CRERBs for those who live in Canada. They have a pandemic. I don't know what they helped in the States. It wasn't like in Canada. Here, people got at least $500 a week. Just the government sent you a check for $500 a week from anybody who lost their job or anything. Just gave, or the government, I don't even know all the details of the program. At least $500, and then they gave billions of dollars to businesses and all the businesses that went bankrupt to keep the economy afloat. They didn't have that. So you're gonna nebuch. But Torah keeps you, and even in old age. You'll be fertile in old age with the learning of the Torah. So I'm going to just teach my children Torah. So how can this be? How can Rav Meir and Rav Nehurai be one and the same person? That's what some say. So I don't know. I don't think the question is so hard to answer either. Like everything in life, the two sides. Because I'm only going to teach my son Torah. Rav Nehurai was not advocating this for everybody. In other words, Rav Meir was giving a general proposition. Rav Meir, that was his comment. For most people, my own son, he's brilliant, whatever. My own children, I want them to be learned Torah all day. So that could be Rav Meir is Rav Nehurai, could be he isn't. So it could also be, this is my own thought, and we'll end with this, and we'll have to pick up next week, please God, that if we assume this Rav Nehurai, it says Rav Nehurai, and the Rav Nehurai in Kiddushin says, I'm going to teach only Torah, and we don't really follow Rav Nehurai. We only follow Rav Meir. The path maybe for the elite view. So you could say it's the same thing here. Havigola lemakom Torah is not meant for everybody. It's only meant for an elite view. I said at the beginning, there's the debate, because in other words, this Rav Nehurai is the Rav Nehurai who says, I'm only going to teach my kids Torah. I'm going to forget all the professions in the world. That's not for my son. My son is only Torah. So that's not the normative Jewish position. Perhaps it's a position for some people, but not for everybody. And so it could be Rav Nehurai. It's that same Rav Nehurai saying here, for the unique person, that person sometimes has to go away. Rav Soloveitchik didn't go away. He learned with his father. That's how he became great, right? So sometimes not. There's more than one path. Anyways, it's getting late, so let's just quickly review what we learned. That having a good name is what it's all about. More important than Torah, more important than Torah. If you learn Torah and you forget, people have a good name. You have to connect. In our generations, it's so important. Where so many don't see the value of Torah. They have to see that someone learns Torah. That's a wonderful person, and they're inspired. Shem Shamayim Tahev Al Yadcha. The name of God, the Shem Tov that we have to give both to ourselves and to our God is beloved because of you, and the Shem Tov, the Keter Shem Tov is the prerequisite and the foundation of the Kahuna, the Malchut, and Torah, and whether, on the one hand, Torah is available for everybody, but on the other hand, it's really greatness in Torah. The Keter is not for everybody, and you have to recognize that. And that's why you go get married, live a normal life, and don't try to become the Vilna Gaon and the Chavetz Chaim. The famous, what's the story? The Hasidic story on Zusha, right? Wasn't that famous story on Yom Kippur? He said he's not afraid when he gets to Shemaim. They're going to ask him, why weren't you like the Vilna Gaon? Why weren't you? That's why weren't you? So that's the most important thing. Having a Keter Shem Tov. We can learn about the Ketarim in the sixth parak, and then how to learn Torah. Do you have to go into Galut, not go into Galut, and the different approaches. And rabbis can't be afraid to take difficult choices and decisions. Rav Skari ben Akulis refused to take a stand to let this sacrifice for the Romans, and the Gemara says it's not literally true. It's not would have changed the course of history, but it doesn't matter. That's the Gemara's understanding. Often these little decisions do often have world effect. Maybe I should take that back. We know World War I started. They all start. There's often a little spark. There are many things there, but the little spark can send it all off. And sometimes you got to take that tough decision. And he was not willing to. Okay, any questions? I'm happy to answer. And any questions, Mr. Zucker? We won't leave until you can ask your
No,
question.
sorry, no questions. Rather, lots of questions.
No, you have to have. It's not the same. If there are no questions, I'll feel like I didn't teach properly.
I'll try to have 2 questions next time.
Okay, all right. You can think of one if not anybody. But okay, a Sunday, Rabbi Liebtag at 11 o'clock. We start our weekly schedule. Just to let you know, of course, I'm sure you should have seen we're having our medical ethics conference on July 11th. It's really a wonderful day, even if you're not a doctor. Many people come who are not doctors. We're doing it live. Wonderful day of learning. That's next Sunday. And of course, the Sunday after that, please God, we'll be having pretty much a full afternoon, 5-6 lectures on Tisha B'Av we'll be having. So, watch your schedule for that. And as I mentioned last night briefly, Rabbi Ziering, Jonathan Ziering, who was, of course, the assistant Rosh Kollel here in Toronto, in the Beit Midrash, Zichron Dov, will be starting a 5-part series on Torah and Shemitah and the rabbinic law. The upcoming year is a Shemitah year. And okay, we look forward to learning with you, and everybody be well. Have a Shabbat Shalom. And okay.
Rabbi, let me just echo something you said. Rabbi said it's because of him that the temple was lost, because he refused to paskin on some, what's his name again?
Right. The Gemara doesn't say what. Rabbi Zechariah ben Akulas was the one who refused to let the Roman sacrifice be brought. So the Talmud kind of ends the story by saying his anivut, because of his humility, the temple was destroyed. The Jewish people were exiled. And I think there's a third thing they say. So the Gemara said, well, what's the connection? What did he do so terrible? He followed what Jewish law says. So you have to understand, sometimes you can't be so exacting in Jewish law. Jewish law has, except you have to look at the broader picture. A posek, that's a difference between a posek who's a computer, who looks at just the technical aspect, but you have to look at the broad aspect. I remember Rav Schechter I remember he once said, so he was talking on women leading, create Hamikil, and he may have even been talking about for men, but for sure for other women. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Rav Schechter made the comment. It's such an important comment. The particulars are less important. The comment was, it could be true that in Hilchot Megillah, a woman can learn the Megillah, maybe even for men in Hilchot Megillah. But you can't just paskin a shaila in Hilchot Megillah by looking at Hilchot Megillah. He said you have to look at Kvarat Siv. You have to look at many broader aspects to paskin. So I sometimes use that in my own personal life. I hope I'm not saying something so terrible. Certain positions, let's say Rav Schechter, who I learned so much from, that I don't agree with. I use the same argument in reverse. In other words, I'm a nobody. I'm not in any posek or anything. I'm just saying that you can't always look at a halachic question just at the question. You have to look at the broader implication. That's clear. If you study halacha, maybe that's surprising to some people, but if you study halacha and how psak works, and people, it's clear from the Gemara, often other factors. So Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas was paskening based on Hilchot Korbanot. In Hilchot Korbanot, you cannot bring a korban that has a slit over its eye, right? But there's halachas of Shalom Malchut. There's halacha of Pikuach Nefesh. He didn't look at those halachas because it was too meek. That's how the Maritz Chai says. He was humble. Isn't being humble good? The anibut, his humility destroyed the temple. I mean, he was unwilling to take a decision. Unlike Moshe Rabbeinu, who was humble, but he still was willing to break the luchot. Maybe he was wrong, maybe he was right. But you can't be so humble that you won't make a decision. That's what I said. That's what Rav Moshe Feinstein writes in his Igra Moshe. Really, I'm a nobody. I mean, he's a nobody, but I shouldn't be. But you know what? You have to do it because there's somebody has to do it, and he's the one. He recognized he was the one. He was the one who had to take the responsibility, and he took some radical tshuvot. With the stroke of the pen, he freed hundreds of thousands of agunot. Right? He says any woman who survived World War II can remarry. Where's the evidence her husband? We don't need evidence her husband's dead. We have modern communications today. If the husband were alive, he'd get in contact with her. We know that's not 100% true. We know there are people who survived, people didn't know. Whatever. But Rav Moshe had the strength. Artificial insemination with the sperm of non-husband, that's okay. So they sent pigs to his house. So he didn't back down. What Rav Moshe was all the time. That's what a great posek does. You can't be humble. You can be humble in how you interact with people. You can't be humble in psak halacha. You have to be bold. All the great poskim were bold. That's what makes them great poskim. It's anybody can look up what it says in the Mishnah Berurah. I mean, anybody, and you can look up. It says it's aser, the Mishnah Berurah, but the great poskim think beyond.
Yes, I feel the phrase halacha and meta halacha.
Right. Now, how to apply it? It takes great great people. That's not so simple. In other words, applying it, it's not simple. But that's the root of many of our debates today are rooted in these halachot, and the big debates on meta issues, right? The much more than the technical aspects.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else? Zev, how are you? Nice to see you. I don't hear you. You are muted.
Sorry, I came late.
Oh, you're okay. Well, you didn't have to tell me. I wouldn't have known. That's a halachic issue. I remember Aaron Levine telling us. Let's say I make an appointment to meet you at 4 o'clock, and I show up at 4:15, and I apologize. I'm sorry, I'm 15 minutes late. Now you showed up at 4:12. So the question is, do you have to tell me? No, you didn't make me wait for 15 minutes. In Gneva Stas, that's I'm not allowed to deceive somebody. Is that a deception? No, halachically, that's an interesting. Or you have to say no because you deceive yourself. I didn't do anything. I'm not saying anything. Just keep your mouth shut. So anyway, so you didn't have to tell me you came late. I wouldn't have known. I give you full marks.
Now you tell me.
Now I know. I can't see when I teach. When I'm teaching, I can't see unless they're right in the screen in front of me. In case people don't know, I usually can't see who's there. Like when I come to classes, other people teach, so I can scroll through, see who's there. But when I'm teaching, I can't do that. I just have to focus.
When does this drasha go online?
Hopefully, I don't know if it'll be before Shabbos or in the beginning of next week. We have somebody who posts them automatically after every. So he doesn't, he has another job. So I don't know if he knows he usually gets them within 24 hours. And I told him the Thursday night Parsha Shir, it's very important to get up by Friday morning. But the Pirkei Avot Shir, I didn't make a big deal about, That's
I'll catch it later.
Catch it later. All right. Have a good one.
Yes, good.
By the way, can I ask you
Shabbat
something?
shalom, everybody. I'm sorry.